The first tremor wasn't in the earth, but in the soul of Karen Dalloway. It registered at 2:17 p.m. on a Tuesday, a time of day she reserved for auditing the architectural harmony of the Primrose Meadows Homeowners Association. From the sealed comfort of her sunroom, which she referred to as the observatory, she watched the world through the unblinking eye of a 4K surveillance camera with a 50x optical zoom. Its lens was trained, as it so often was, on the property of one Alex Mercer, the renegade landscape artist at number 24, and that's when she saw it. It wasn't a flagrant violation, like the garish pink flamingo incident of 22, or one, like the unpermitted solar panel fiasco of last fall. This was an act of pure, unadulterated aesthetic terrorism. Mercer, a man whose biceps strained against the fabric of his t-shirt in a manner Karen found both vulgar and unsettling, was directing the placement of a large, black pond liner into a freshly dug hole in his backyard, a koi pond, an unapproved koi pond. It was a gaping wound in the otherwise immaculate green flesh of the neighborhood. A low growl, like the sound of grinding stones, escaped Karen's lips. "Oh no you don't," she whispered to the high-resolution image of Mercer's smiling face. "Not on my watch." Karen Dalloway was not your average HOA president. To her, the thick binder of covenants, conditions, and restrictions wasn't a set of guidelines. It was scripture. She was the high priestess of its esoteric truths, the guardian of its sacred bylaws. Her late husband, Richard, a man who had been a structural engineer with a passion for zoning law, had been the one who drafted the Primrose Meadows Charter. He had spoken of setbacks, easements, and material consistency with the fiery passion of a prophet. When he passed, he hadn't just left Karen a house and a healthy pension. He had bequeathed to her a holy mission. Maintaining Primrose Meadows wasn't just a duty. It was an act of eternal love, a testament to Richard's belief that order was the only thing standing between civilization and chaos. Alex Mercer was chaos incarnate. He had moved in 2 years ago and immediately began treating his property not as a component of a cohesive whole, but as his personal canvas. He'd installed a winding flagstone path that violated the linear walkway mandate Section 4, subsection B. He'd planted a weeping willow whose mournful fronds would, in a few years, undoubtedly encroach upon the airspace of his neighbor, Mrs. Gable, a clear violation of the Arboreal Airspace Treaty, Addendum C, and now, this, a water feature. The bylaws were explicitly clear. All water features exceeding a depth of 18 inches required a formal review by the Architectural Control Committee, of which Karen was, naturally, the chair, sole member, and final arbiter. Her first move was by the book. She printed a violation notice on the HOA's official letterhead, her laser printer spitting it out with a satisfying hum. She cited Bylaw 7.14, unauthorized terrestrial excavation and artificial aquifer creation. She gave him 10 business days to remediate the violation, a euphemism for fill in that godforsaken hole and pretend this nightmare never happened. She sealed it in a crisp envelope and marched across the street, her posture as rigid as a surveyor's rod. She didn't ring the bell. That was too personal, too informal. She wedged the notice firmly between the door and the jamb position, from which it could not be ignored. She rapped her knuckles on the door, twice a sharp, authoritarian sound pivoted on her sensible walking shoes. Marching back to her observatory to watch, she saw Mercer open the door a few minutes later. He plucked the letter, read it, and then did something that made the blood freeze in Karen's veins. He laughed. It wasn't a small chuckle. It was a deep, full-throated laugh that seemed to shake the very foundations of his unapproved flagstone path. Then he crumpled the notice and tossed it, with a perfect basketball arc, into a nearby recycling bin. For a moment, Karen couldn't breathe. It was a rejection not just of the notice, but of the entire system, of Richard's legacy, of her. The battle lines had been drawn. Her second step was to escalate. She emailed the entire HOA mailing list, a carefully worded missive, titled Urgent, Community Integrity at Risk. She outlined the violation in stark, terrifying terms, hinting at potential sinkholes, mosquito infestations, and declining property values. She called for a neighborhood meeting to discuss a collective response. The response was tepid. Mark from number 18 replied, "Looks pretty cool actually. You think he'd do one for me?" Sarah from number 32 wrote, "Karen, with all due respect, don't you have anything better to do?" The collective she had hoped to rally was apathetic, more interested in Alex's charming smile and free-spirited nature than in the sanctity of their bylaws. They saw a nice man building a nice pond. Karen saw a barbarian at the gates. Her third attempt was a direct confrontation. She waited until she saw him outside, watering a bed of offensively vibrant, non-native flowers. She marched, over her face a mask of cold fury. "Mr. Mercer," she began, her voice devoid of warmth. He turned, a hose in his hand, and gave her a smile that was infuriatingly genuine. "Karen, good afternoon. Come to admire the zinnias. They're really taking off. I am here to discuss the illegal reservoir you are constructing in your backyard," she said, clipping each word. "You received my notice." "Ah, yes, the artificial aquifer creation notice," he said. That damnable twinkle in his eye sounded a bit biblical. I have to say, your writing is very evocative. This isn't a joke. You are in direct violation. You have 7 days left to comply before the fines begin. Fines, right. He leaned against his fence, a casual posture that screamed disrespect. Look, Karen, it's a small pond for a few fish. It's going to be beautiful. It's not hurting anyone. It makes the backyard a nicer place to be. Isn't that the point of having a backyard? The point of this community, Karen corrected, her voice rising, is to adhere to a set of standards that protects our collective investment and ensures a uniform aesthetic. Your project is a grotesque anomaly. A grotesque anomaly. He laughed again. That same booming sound. It's a hole with some water in it. Karen, I think you need to relax. Maybe I'll bring you over a nice cup of herbal tea when it's done. You can sit by the water and listen to the babbling brook. It'll lower your blood pressure. He thought this was about blood pressure. He thought this was about her. The sheer unmitigated arrogance of the man. He saw a stressed-out woman. She saw herself as the last Roman legionary defending Hadrian's wall. She turned without another word, her mind racing. The legal route was a dead end. The court of public opinion was a lost cause. He would simply ignore the fines, forcing the HOA into a costly legal battle that the other members would never approve. He had won. He had beaten the system. Back in the observatory, she watched him work, his muscles flexing as he smoothed the liner. He was whistling. The sound was a drill boring into her sanity. She felt a wave of despair, a hollow feeling that Richard's world was slipping away, being replaced by a chaotic mess of weeping willows and koi ponds. She looked at Richard's portrait on the mantelpiece, a stern but loving man in a crisp suit. What would you do, Richard? She asked. Silently. You wouldn't have let this happen. Her gaze drifted from the portrait to the bookshelf beside it. It was filled with Richard's old engineering texts, geological surveys, and city planning manuals. And there, on the bottom shelf, was a thick, leather-bound portfolio. It was the original master plan for Primrose Meadows, circa 1988. She hadn't looked at it in years. With a sense of renewed purpose, she pulled it from the shelf. The pages were heavy, smelling of old paper and graphite. She unrolled the main blueprint across her dining room table. It was a work of art, a symphony of precise lines and neat lettering. Every property, every utility line, every gradient was meticulously documented. Richard's handwriting was everywhere. She ran her finger over the property line between number 22 her house and number 24 She saw the gas lines, the water mains, the sewage pipes, and then she saw something else. A faint, dotted line, labeled DCOM, Utility Easement -1954. It was an old pre-subdivision easement for a storm drain that had been rendered obsolete. When the main sewer was installed in the 80s, it ran from the street, cut straight across the front of her property, and then veered sharply, running directly along the property line at the back of her yard. And his. It passed less than 10 feet from the location of the nascent pond. It was an empty space beneath the ground. A ghost corridor. She stared at the dotted line, and a thought, wild and terrifying and beautiful in its sheer audacity, began to form in her mind. It was a thought so far outside the covenant's conditions and restrictions that it existed in a different reality altogether. The bylaws gave her authority over what happened on the properties of Primrose Meadows, but Mercer had demonstrated that her authority was unenforceable without his consent. He had built a fortress of charm and apathy around his transgressions. She couldn't get to him. She couldn't get the evidence she needed, the precise measurements of depth and volume to force the issue. To trespass would be to cede the moral high ground, but what if she didn't trespass on his property? What if she went under it? The thought was insane. It was the idea of a madwoman. A 62-year-old widow in sensible shoes does not simply dig a tunnel. But Richard hadn't just been a man of rules. He had beat. The boxers from Appalachian Underground Outfitters arrived on a Friday, discreetly packaged in plain brown cardboard. Karen had the delivery driver leave them on the porch, and she waited until the truck was a distant speck before she scurried out, her heart thumping a nervous rhythm against her ribs. She dragged the heavy containers inside, her muscles protesting. This was the first test. If she couldn't handle moving the equipment, she certainly couldn't handle excavating several tons of earth. But the fire of her conviction burned hotter than the ache in her back. She was committed. She stashed the boxers in the unfinished section of her basement, a gray, dusty space that smelled of concrete and time. It was her staging area, her mission control. For the rest of the day, she was a whirlwind of meticulous preparation, a side of her that even Richard would have admired. She covered the floor with thick plastic sheeting to manage the inevitable mess. She set up a work table and carefully unboxed her new tools, arranging them with the precision of a surgeon. The demolition hammer was heavier than she'd expected, a dense, metallic beast. The helmet felt alien on her head, its light cutting a sharp, white circle in the gloom. Her biggest logistical challenge was the dirt. A tunnel, even a small one, would produce a mountain of excavated soil. She couldn't just pile it in her backyard. That would be a violation of half a dozen bylaws, and would immediately give her away. The solution came to her during a late-night perusal of a gardening forum. heavy-duty, woven polypropylene garden bags. They were sturdy, held up to 100 pounds each. And, most importantly, they were unassuming. She ordered 200 of them. Her plan was to fill them, seal them, and then, under the cover of darkness, methodically distribute them among her municipal trash and recycling bins over a period of weeks. A few extra pounds here and there would never be noticed. It was a slow, laborious, but perfectly discreet system of waste disposal. The moment of truth arrived on a moonless Saturday night. The neighborhood was quiet, the only sound the distant hum of the freeway. Dressed in old overalls she hadn't worn in 30 years, her face set with grim determination, Karen hoisted the electric demolition hammer. The instructions were simple. Enough. Plug it in, hold it tight, and press the trigger. She braced herself against the concrete wall that separated her basement from the soil of her side yard. The first leg of her journey towards Mercer's property line. She pulled the trigger. The world exploded in a cataclysm of noise. The hammer roared to life, a deafening, bone-jarring concussion that vibrated up her arms and into her skull. It felt like holding onto a runaway jackhammer. For a terrifying second, she thought the tool would wrench itself from her grasp and pinball around the basement, but she held on, grit her teeth, and pressed the chisel tip into the concrete. Dust and grit filled the air, and a spider web of cracks appeared on the wall. The sound was immense, surely loud enough to wake the dead, let alone the neighbors. She worked in frantic 30-second bursts, her ears ringing, her eyes scanning the small basement window for any sign of alarm from outside. After an hour that felt like a lifetime, a chunk of concrete broke free, thudding onto the plastic sheeting. She had breached the perimeter. Through the jagged hole, she could see it. The dark, rich soil of Primrose Meadows. It smelled earthy and damp, the scent of secrets and hidden things. It was the smell of her new kingdom. The days that followed blurred into a grueling, surreal routine. By day, she was Karen Dalloway, HOA president. She answered emails about overgrown hedges and improperly stored trash bins. She took her daily walk, nodding curtly to neighbors, her face an unreadable mask, but by night, she transformed. She would descend into her basement, don her helmet and gloves, and become a creature of the earth. The digging was harder than she could have ever imagined. The sandy loam was stable, as the book had promised, but it was dense and heavy. The first few feet were the worst. She used a short-handled spade, filling bucket after bucket, which she then emptied into the poly bags. Each filled bag was a small victory, a tangible piece of her progress. Her muscles screamed in protest. Her hands, even through the thick gloves, became a landscape of blisters and calluses. She discovered aches in places she didn't know. One night, exhausted and covered in a film of sweat and dirt, she almost gave up. Her back was a column of fire. Her arms felt like lead. She sat on an overturned bucket in the suffocating darkness of her nascent tunnel, which now extended about 5 feet from her foundation. What was she doing? This was madness. She was a respectable widow, not a mole person. She could hear the faint sound of a television from her neighbor's house, a reminder of the normal world she had left behind. Then, through the thin wall of earth, she heard something else, the sound of splashing water, followed by laughter. He was out there, enjoying his forbidden pond. The sound was like a shot of adrenaline. Her despair curdled back into cold, hard resolve. She picked up her spade. The laughter was a fuel, burning away her fatigue. She developed a rhythm. Dig for 2 hours, haul the dirt back into the basement, bag it, then spend an hour installing the shoring. Richard had taught her the principles of cut and cover. She used the interlocking pine boards to create a sturdy, box-like frame every 3 feet. It was slow, painstaking work, but the thought of a cave-in was a powerful motivator. The tunnel became her sanctuary and her prison. Down there, the petty squabbles of the HOA faded away. There were only the immediate physical realities, the resistance of the soil, the weight of the bucket, the fit of the next shoring beam. She began to change. The meticulous order of her house started to fray at the edges. A fine layer of dust seemed to settle on everything. No matter how often she cleaned, she lost weight, her face becoming leaner, her eyes more intense. When she looked in the mirror, she saw a stranger looking back. A wild woman with dirt under her fingernails and an obsessive gleam in her gaze. There were close calls that tested her nerve to its breaking point. One afternoon, Mrs. Gable from next door stopped her while she was taking out a particularly heavy trash bin. "Goodness, Karen," the elderly woman chirped, starting a new weightlifting regimen. Karen's heart leaped into her throat. She forced a thin smile. "Just some spring cleaning, Martha. You know how it is? Getting rid of old books. They're heavier than you think." She held her breath until Martha toddled away, her secret safe. Another time, a utility worker came to read the meter on the side of her house, just feet from where her tunnel began. She watched him from the observatory, her body rigid with tension, praying he wouldn't notice the patch of slightly disturbed soil she'd tried to disguise with fallen leaves. He came, he read the meter, he left. Karen felt a wave of relief. So profound it left her weak. As she dug, her mind often drifted to Richard. She'd find herself replaying his lectures on soil mechanics and structural integrity. In the lonely, silent darkness of the tunnel, he felt closer than he had in years. She wasn't just digging a tunnel. She was communing with him, using the skills and knowledge he had given her. This project, insane as it was the most profound tribute she could pay to his memory. It was an application of his entire worldview in its most literal, elemental form. She was imposing order on the chaos of the earth itself. After 3 weeks of relentless labor, she estimated she was nearly 30 feet in, well past her own property line and now tunneling directly alongside the edge of Mercer's domain. She had reached the old oak tree that stood as a sentinel between their 2 yards, and that's when she hit the root. It wasn't like hitting a rock. It was a thick fibrous mass, a wooden serpent blocking her path. Her spade clanged against it, uselessly. She tried digging around it, but it was a central artery of the ancient tree, a tangled knot of woody tentacles. It was an absolute impasse. For 2 days, she was stymied. Frustration gnawed at her. To have come so far, to have endured so much, only to be defeated by a tree. It felt like nature itself was conspiring with Mercer, protecting his chaotic little paradise. She sat in the tunnel, her headlamp illuminating the gnarled, unyielding obstacle. Defeat was a bitter taste in her mouth. She thought about Richard again. He had been a problem solver. He would have looked at this not as a wall, but as a puzzle. How would he have solved it? Brute force was useless. She couldn't bring a chainsaw down here. Then she remembered something he'd told her when they were removing a stubborn stump in their own yard years ago. You don't fight the strength, Karen. You find the weakness. She spent the next night not digging, but exploring. She took a small hand trowel and patiently, carefully, began to excavate the soil around the main root, tracing its smaller offshoots. It was like archaeological work. After hours of delicate probing, she found what she was looking for, a small gap, a place where 2 of the larger roots diverged, leaving a space just big enough for her to squeeze through. If she could clear the smaller tendrils and compacted soil between them, she traded her spade for a small hand axe and a serrated garden. Knifed, for the next 3 nights, she engaged in a brutal, claustrophobic battle with the tree. She hacked, sawed, and clawed at the web of smaller roots, her arms burning with the effort. The space was so tight she could barely swing the axe. Splinters flew, and the air filled with the sharp clean. For Alex Mercer, the first sign that something was profoundly weird in Primrose Meadows was not a letter or a confrontation, but the behavior of his dog, Buster. Buster was a golden retriever of cheerful disposition and low intellect, a creature whose primary concerns were food, tennis balls, and belly rubs. But for the past week, Buster had developed a strange obsession with a particular patch of lawn near the back fence, the one bordering the yard of the neighborhood's resident dragon, Karen Dalloway. He would sit there for hours, head cocked, his tail giving a low, uncertain thump-thump against the grass. Occasionally, he would let out a low woof, not a bark of alarm, but a sound of deep and abiding confusion. Then he started digging, not the playful digging for a lost toy, but a frantic, determined scratching at the turf, as if he were trying to unearth some great, buried truth. "What is it, boy?" Alex would ask, trying to lure him away with a squeaky toy. But Buster was inconsolable, whining and staring at the ground as if he could hear something. Alex could and single quotes Alex. A man who lived by intuition and creative flow, initially dismissed it. Dogs were weird. But other things, small anomalies, began to pile up. A series of hairline cracks appeared in the concrete base of his new retaining wall, also near Karen's fence. The ground there seemed softer. After a heavy rain, a puddle formed and stayed for 2 days, as if the soil beneath had mysteriously lost its ability to drain properly. He was a landscape artist, not an engineer, but he knew the land. He knew its textures, its smells, its sounds, and the land in that corner of his yard felt wrong. It felt hollow. His first thought was a sinkhole or a broken water pipe. He called the city. A board employee checked the municipal plans and assured him there were no active water lines in that specific area. A sinkhole. Possible, but highly unlikely in this region, they said. Probably just settling. The voice on the phone concluded, dripping with disinterest. Alex wasn't convinced. Settling didn't explain Buster's sonic fixation. He thought of Karen, her fanatical opposition to his pond, her chillingly silent retreat after their last confrontation. It wasn't like her to give up. Karen Dalloway did not give up. She escalated. He had been waiting for the other shoe to drop. Lawsuit, a public shaming campaign, perhaps a volley of flaming arrows over the fence, but there had been nothing. Just a profound, unsettling silence. The silence, combined with the weirdness of the ground, began to coalesce into a suspicion. So bizarre, so utterly unhinged, that he almost laughed it off. Almost. But this was Karen Dalloway. The normal rules of human behavior did not apply. One evening, armed with a cold beer and a growing sense of surreal dread, he went online and did some research. He looked up DIY seismic sensors and acoustic ground listening devices. The professional gear was thousands of dollars, but the articles led him to a simpler, older technique. The humble stethoscope. The next morning, feeling like the world's biggest fool, he borrowed the Littman stethoscope his sister, a nurse, had left at his house. He went to the spot where Buster was holding his vigil, pressed the cold metal diaphragm to the grass, and stuck the earpieces in his ears. He heard his own breathing, the distant rumble of a truck on the main road, a bird chirping, and then something else. A faint, rhythmic sound. Scrape, thump, scrape, thump. It was muffled, subterranean, but it was unmistakably the sound of work, of digging. Alex pulled the stethoscope from his ears, his mouth agape. His wild, insane, impossible theory was true. Karen Dalloway, the 62-year-old priestess of lawn maintenance and beige paint swatches, had dug a tunnel into his yard. The sheer magnificent insanity of it was breathtaking. His first reaction wasn't anger, but a wave of profound, disbelieving awe. She was a geriatric Dr. Evil operating out of a suburban basement. His awe quickly gave way to a surge of creative, chaotic energy. He could call the police. That would be the sane, rational thing to do. It would be the end of it. But where was the fun in that? Where was the art? Karen had escalated their conflict from the bureaucratic to the geological. To respond with a simple phone call felt like bringing a strongly worded letter to a cannon fight. No, her move demanded a response in kind. She had chosen the Earth itself, and Alex, a man who shaped the Earth for a living, decided he would answer her on his own terms. He wasn't going to get mad. He was going to get creative. Meanwhile, 60 feet away, and 10 feet down, Karen was enjoying the fruits of her labor. She had established a small, shored-up listening post directly beneath the southeast corner of Alex's pond. She could hear everything. The gurgle of the filter, the hum of the pump, the splash of a fish. It was the perfect position for her final gambit. She had brought a small, cordless drill and a fiber-optic endoscope camera, the kind plumbers use to inspect pipes. Her plan was to drill a tiny quarter-inch pilot hole up through the remaining soil and the pond liner itself. She would thread the camera through, document the pond's depth and construction, then retract it and plug the minuscule hole with a waterproof epoxy. It was elegant, efficient, and would leave almost no trace. She was savoring the moment, preparing her tools for the final breach. She felt a surge of righteous power. She had outsmarted him, outmaneuvered him, burrowed beneath the foundations of his arrogance. This was her victory lap. That's when she heard a new sound from above, a deep, guttural roar that vibrated through the soil. It was heavy machinery. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her. Had he discovered her? Was he excavating the tunnel? She pressed her ear to the ceiling of her earthen cocoon, her heart hammering. The sound was loud, but it seemed to be moving around, not concentrating in one spot. Then she heard voices, including Alex's. Yeah, just expanding it a bit. Alex's voice drifted down, muffled but clear enough, adding a waterfall feature. The sound of running water is so relaxing. You know, a waterfall. Karen let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. It was a coincidence, a blessed lucky coincidence. He wasn't digging her up. He was just engaging in more unapproved landscape modification. The fool, he was unwittingly making her case for her, adding more evidence of his flagrant disregard for the rules. She decided to wait. Let him finish his new project. It would only make her eventual triumph that much sweeter. Up on the surface, Alex was putting on a masterclass of plausible deniability. He had indeed rented a mini excavator. He puttered around the yard with it for an hour, making a show for any curious neighbors. He dug a shallow trench near the pond, piling the dirt artfully. To anyone watching, he was simply a man adding a new feature to his beloved water garden. Buster sat nearby, whining, his gaze fixed on the ground. "It's okay, boy," Alex said, patting his head. "We're just making some improvements." But Alex's real work wasn't with the excavator. It was with a coiled black hose connected to his main water spigot. His plan was simple, elegant, and deeply malicious. Karen had built her tunnel in soil that was, until now, relatively dry. He had learned from his online research that sandy loam, the very soil that made her digging possible, lost all its structural integrity when it became saturated. It didn't just get muddy, it could liquefy. He waited until dusk. The excavator sat idle. The neighborhood grew quiet. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that she was down there. She was probably listening, gloating, preparing for her next move. It was time for his. He took the end of the heavy-duty hose and placed it in the shallow trench he had dug, aiming it directly at the patch of ground Buster had been so obsessed with. He walked back to the spigot, took a deep breath, and turned the valve all the way. Water surged through the hose, gushing out onto the ground with tremendous force. It didn't form a puddle on the surface. Instead, the parched, disturbed soil drank it greedily. The ground seemed to sigh as it absorbed the deluge. He wasn't just watering the lawn. He was performing a targeted injection. He was flooding the earth, introducing a massive volume of water directly into the soil matrix surrounding Karen's hidden creation. Down in the tunnel, Karen was tidying her small workspace, humming a little tune. She was feeling triumphant, almost giddy. The roar of the excavator had stopped, and a peaceful quiet had descended. And then she felt it. A single drop of cold water on her cheek. She looked up. A dark wet spot had appeared on the pine shoring board above her head. As she watched, another drop formed and fell. Then another. It was a leak. He must have cracked the pond liner with his digging. she tutted in annoyance. The shoddy workmanship of that man was truly appalling, but the dripping didn't stop. It accelerated. A steady trickle began to run down the shoring beam. The soil packed between the boards began to darken and sag. A strange groaning sound echoed through the tunnel, the sound of stressed wood and shifting earth. The trickle became a steady stream. Muddy water began to pour in, pooling around her sensible walking shoes. Panic, real and absolute, seized her. This wasn't a small leak. This was something else. This was a flood. Above her, Alex stood in the growing darkness, the hose still gushing, a grim expression on his face. The ground at his feet was now a soupy morass. He had emptied the equivalent of a small swimming pool into the earth. He turned off the spigot. And then he waited. The final sound Karen heard before the world ended was not a roar or a crash. It was a soft, sickening. There is a unique quality to absolute darkness when it is combined with absolute silence. For Karen Dalloway, trapped 10 feet underground, it was a living entity. It pressed in on her, a physical weight on her eyes and ears. The roaring, sucking chaos of the collapse had lasted only a few seconds, a terrifying eternity of groaning timbers and a tidal wave of mud. Then, silence. A silence so profound it was a sound in itself, the humming of her own terrified nervous system. She was not dead. That was the first coherent thought that managed to claw its way through the panic. She was not crushed. The collapse had been less a crushing and more a filling. The tunnel had caved in at a weak point just behind her and another just ahead, creating a pocket, a tomb. She was entombed. She tried to move, but her legs were pinned, encased in a thick, cold sludge that was rapidly setting like wet concrete. She could move her arms and her torso, but only just. She reached out and her fingers met a wall of solid, wet earth. She reached behind her and met the same pine shoring boards that had been her assurance of safety were now part of her prison, their splintered ends poking into the muck around her. "Help," she whispered, the sound swallowed by the suffocating closeness. She tried again, louder. "Help." The cry was pathetic, a dry, scratchy sound that seemed to travel no further than her own face. The mud and earth absorbed it completely. No one could hear her. No one even knew she was here. The water was the worst part. It was everywhere. Her overalls were saturated, clinging to her skin like an icy shroud. The mud was a slurry of earth and water, and it was still settling, the water slowly seeping out and pooling around her waist. She could feel the cold leaching the warmth from her body, a creeping, insidious chill that went straight to her bones. "This is it," she thought. "This is how I die. Drowned in mud under my enemy's garden." The sheer pathetic indignity of it was almost worse than the fear. All her planning, her meticulous work, her righteous crusade had all led to this. A cold, dark, muddy grave. Time ceased to have meaning. Minutes stretched into agonizing eternities. Every rustle of settling earth, every trickle of water, sent a fresh jolt of terror through her. Her mind, stripped of all its usual certainties and bylaws, began to unravel. It played tricks on her, projecting images onto the screen of the darkness. She saw Richard's face, not his stern, approving portrait face, but his face in the final days at the hospital, pale and confused. "You have to keep things in order, Karen," he had rasped, his hand frail in hers. "Without order, it all just falls apart. It all just falls apart." The words echoed in her subterranean prison. Had she been maintaining order, or had she been creating chaos? Her tunnel, her secret weapon of enforcement, had literally collapsed. Her quest for control had resulted in the most profound loss of control imaginable. She was utterly, completely, helpless, a prisoner of the very earth she had sought to command. A wave of regret, so powerful it felt like nausea, washed over her. Not regret for her mission, but for its execution. She had been arrogant. She had underestimated her opponent. Mercer wasn't just a simple-minded brute who liked pretty flowers. He must have known. The waterfall story, the heavy machinery, the sudden flood, it was all a trap. He had played her. He had turned her own weapon, her own tunnel, against her. He had buried her alive. The cold was becoming a serious problem. She started to shiver violently, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. Hypothermia. She knew the signs. First the shivering, then confusion, then a strange, warm peacefulness as the body's core temperature plummeted and the organs began to shut down. Was this what was happening? Was she already dying? She fought against the encroaching lethargy. She had to stay awake. She had to do something. She tried to dig with her hands, clawing uselessly at the compacted mud in front of her. It was like trying to dig through clay. She only succeeded in breaking her fingernails and rubbing her fingertips. Raw. The effort left her breathless, her heart hammering against her ribs. Exhausted, she slumped back, the cold mud sucking at her. Despair was a heavy blanket. This was a grave of her own making, a monument to her own hubris. The great Karen Dalloway, president of the Primrose Meadows, HOA, bested by a landscaper and a garden hose. The cosmic irony was crushing. How long had it been? An hour? 3? 5? There was no way to know. The outside world, with its sun and its clocks and its routines, had ceased to exist. There was only the cold, the dark, and the mud. And then, a new sound. It was faint at first, a high-pitched whine that seemed to come from far away. She thought it was another auditory hallucination, her dying brain playing its final tricks. But it grew louder, more insistent. It was a mechanical sound, a drilling sound. Hope and emotion she had completely abandoned flickered feebly in her chest. Was it a rescue team? Had someone seen the ground collapse? A sinkhole? The drilling grew louder and louder, seeming to come from directly in front of her face. The mud vibrated with the noise. She flinched back, shielding her eyes even though there was no light. Suddenly, with a final, grinding screech, something broke through the wall of earth just a foot from her head. It was a pipe. A white PVC pipe, about 3 inches in diameter, its ends smeared with mud. It pushed its way into her small pocket of existence like a strange mechanical serpent. Karen stared at it, her mind struggling to process what was happening. Was it a gas line? A water pipe she had somehow missed? Then a voice came through the pipe. It was distorted, tinny, and amplified, as if spoken through a megaphone pressed against the other end. But it was utterly, terrifyingly unmistakable. "Having trouble with your inspection, Karen," was Alex Mercer's voice. The blood in Karen's veins turned to ice. It wasn't a rescue. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a confirmation. He knew. He had been watching. He had been in control this entire time. He had buried her, and now he was talking to her through a pipe like she was some specimen in a jar. "This is Alex. By the way," the voice continued, a chillingly conversational tone echoing in the pipe. "Just wanted to make sure you had enough air. Wouldn't want you to get uncomfortable while you're trespassing." The word trespassing hit her like a physical blow. He had turned the tables so completely, so utterly, that he was now accusing her of the very crime she had been trying to document. "Let me out of here," she screamed, her voice a raw, desperate croak. "You buried me. You tried to kill me. Kill. You Karen, that's a terrible accusation," the voice from the pipe replied, a feigned innocence in its tone that was more terrifying than any threat. "I was just doing some landscaping. I discovered a rather large sinkhole on my property. Very dangerous. I was just about to call the authorities, but then I heard a faint tapping sound, so I drilled a little exploratory hole. Imagine my surprise when I found you in it. What on earth were you doing down there?" He was building his narrative, his alibi. The plausible deniability was a work of art in its pure, unadulterated cruelty. He wasn't the man who had collapsed a tunnel on his neighbor. He was the hero who had discovered her trapped in a freak accident. "You flooded it. You did this on purpose," she shrieked, clawing at the mud, her hysteria mounting. "Flooded? You mean the water for the waterfall feature?" "Yes. A terrible coincidence. It seems the excavation for that must have weakened the ground and caused the collapse." "Tragic. Really? You're lucky I was here to find you." The voice paused. "Now here's the thing, Karen. I can call 911 right now. The fire department will come. They'll dig you out. There will be news crews, reporters, all of our neighbors. The story will be local HOA president found trapped in mysterious tunnel in neighbor's yard. Your reputation, your authority, everything you've built your life around, will be gone. You'll be the crazy old lady who digs tunnels. A local legend. A punchline." Karen's mind raced, the cold and fear momentarily replaced by the frantic calculations of a cornered animal. He was right. Public exposure was a fate worse than death. The humiliation would be absolute, annihilating. Or, the voice from the pipe continued, low and deliberate, "You and I can come to an understanding. A new covenant, if you will." Silence descended again, broken only by the drip of water and Karen's ragged breathing. He wasn't just rescuing her. He was negotiating the terms of her surrender from a position of absolute power. She was trapped in a cold, dark hole of his making, and he was dictating the treaty. "What? What do you want?" she managed to stammer, the words tasting like defeat. "It's very simple." Alex's voice echoed from the pipe, calm and clear and final. "You're going to resign from the HOA immediately. You're going to drop all outstanding violations against me and everyone else in this neighborhood. You're going to approve my pond, my willow tree, and any other grotesque anomalies I might choose to install in the future. You are going to leave me, and everyone else, alone. In return, I will heroically rescue you from this unfortunate sinkhole. No one ever needs to know the truth. It will be our little secret." He was dismantling her world, piece by piece, by law. He was demanding not just a ceasefire, but the complete and unconditional dissolution of her reign. It was everything she stood for, everything she had fought for, everything Richard had believed in. She thought about the humiliation of the public rescue, the news cameras, the smirking faces of the neighbors. She had lorded it over for years. The rescue was a masterpiece of performative heroism. From her muddy prison, Karen heard the sounds of the world returning. First, Alex's voice, now without the pipe, shouting theatrically, "Hello, is anyone down there?" I heard a voice. Then, the distant wail of sirens, growing closer and closer. The digging, when it began, was not the quiet scraping of her own work, but the efficient, powerful thrust of firefighter shovels. Bright lights sliced through the darkness above, and fresh air, sweet and intoxicating, flooded her small chamber. Hands reached down, strong and anonymous, and pulled her from the sucking embrace of the mud dot. she emerged into a world of flashing red and blue lights, a blinking, chaotic nightmare. She was a creature born from the earth, caked head to toe in thick, brown mud, her hair matted, her face a streaked mask. Firefighters wrapped her in a thick blanket. Paramedics guided her to a waiting ambulance, their faces a mixture of professional concern and sheer bewilderment, and everywhere there were faces. The faces of her neighbors, drawn from their homes by the commotion. Mark from number 18, Sarah from number 32, old Mrs. Gable. They stared at her, their expressions a cocktail of shock, pity, and morbid curiosity. This was the public humiliation she had bartered her entire world to avoid, yet here it was, a diluted, but still potent version of her worst nightmare. And then she saw him. Alex Mercer was standing by the edge of the newly dubbed sinkhole, giving a statement to a police officer. He had a blanket wrapped around his shoulders too, for effect. He looked concerned, heroic, the very picture of the good neighbor. He caught her eye as the paramedics helped her into the ambulance. He didn't smile, he didn't gloat. He just gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a nod that said, "A deal is a deal." At the hospital, she was treated for mild hypothermia and exhaustion. She refused to answer any questions about how she ended up in the hole, sticking to a mumbled, "I don't remember. I think I was gardening, and the ground just gave way." The story was thin, absurd, but no one had a better one. The official report listed the cause as an unexplained subterranean soil displacement. When she returned home the next day, the silence was the first thing she noticed. Her house, once a fortress of order, felt like a museum. Her phone did not ring. Her email inbox, usually full of HOA business, was empty. The news had spread. She was no longer Karen, the formidable president. She was Karen, the crazy sinkhole lady. True to her word, she typed out her resignation letter that afternoon. Her hands trembled as she wrote, "Due to personal health reasons, I am stepping down as president and member of the Architectural Control Committee, effective immediately." She emailed it to the HOA secretary and CC'd the entire neighborhood mailing list. Then, with a feeling of profound emptiness, she took the thick binder of covenants, conditions, and restrictions Richard's scripture and placed it in a cardboard box. The days that followed were a blur of shame and isolation. She watched from her observatory as a fence went up around the sinkhole in Alex's yard. A few days later, a cement truck arrived. He wasn't just filling the hole. He was reinforcing it, building a proper foundation for his expanding pond and waterfowl. He was erasing the evidence of her tunnel, of her war, and building his own monument on its ruins. She lost her fire. The sight of a non-compliant mailbox or an overgrown lawn no longer sparked outrage, only a dull, hollow ache. The rules had no meaning without the power to enforce them. Her life's purpose, the sacred mission Richard had bestowed upon her, had been extinguished. She was just a lonely woman in a quiet house. She put her house on the market a week later. She couldn't stay here, in the shadow of her defeat. A few days before she was scheduled to move, the doorbell rang. It was Alex. He stood on her doorstep, not with a smirk, but with a strangely neutral expression. He held a small potted orchid, a housewarming gift, he said, then corrected himself. "I guess it's a houseschooling gift. I heard you were moving." Karen stared at him, speechless. The audacity was incredible. "Get off my property," she said, her voice a low rasp. "I just came to say I'm sorry it came to that." "Karen," he said, his voice quiet. The dam of her composure broke. "Sorry. You buried me alive. You terrorized me. I stabilized a dangerous excavation that was threatening the foundation of my property," he countered, his voice still calm, his gaze unwavering. "The soil was ... unstable. You of all people should understand the importance of maintaining a safe and stable environment." He was using her own language against her, twisting the gospel of Richard into a justification for his own actions. The cold, calculated brilliance of it left her breathless. He was not a barbarian. He was a master strategist who had simply outplayed her at every turn. "What do you want, Alex?" she asked, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "Nothing," he said, placing the orchid on her doorstep. "The pond is beautiful. The waterfall is very relaxing. Buster doesn't stare at the fence anymore. I just wanted to say goodbye." He turned and walked away, leaving her alone with the offensively vibrant, unapproved flower. The final days were spent packing up her life, a grim archaeology of her marriage and her reign. She boxed up Richard's clothes, his books, his awards. It was in the back of his old office closet, behind a stack of tax returns from the 1990s, that she found it, a heavy, locked metal box she had never seen before. Curiosity piqued. She found the key on an old ring labeled projects. Inside was not what she expected. It wasn't full of personal mementos or financial documents. It was full of blueprints. Dozens of them, rolled up and secured with rubber bands. They were not just for Primrose Meadows. They were for subdivisions all across the state. Oak Valley Estates, Cypress Point, Riverbend Crossing. Richard had been involved in far more developments than she had ever known, but it was the markings on them that made her blood run cold. They were his neat, precise handwriting, but they weren't about bylaws or aesthetics. They were notes in a code she didn't understand. but whose intent was clear. Soil instability, Sector G, viable. Pre-existing utility tunnel. Access point number 3, clear. Geological fault line, prime for settling event. And on one blueprint, for a new luxury development called Crimson Hawk Ridge, about 50 miles away, there was a post-it note. On it was a name, Arthur Vance. Taped next to the note was a newspaper clipping from a few months ago. It was an article about a bitter legal dispute over the Crimson Hawk development, with a quote from the lead landscape architect who had been hired for the project. The architect was complaining about the developer, Arthur Vance, cutting corners. On the geological surveys, the architect's name was Alex Mercer. A jolt went through Karen, a charge of electricity that felt terrifyingly familiar. It was the old fire, the old purpose. Returning from the ashes. This wasn't just about HOA rules. Richard hadn't just been a stickler for order, the decommissioned easement under her yard, the soil composition. Had he known, had he left a hidden network of these opportunities. Prime for settling event? It was a blueprint for weaponizing the earth itself. Her tunnel hadn't been an original idea born of madness. It had been an echo, an unknowing imitation, of a far grander, more sinister design. And Alex. His casual mention of a big new project with a difficult developer, his expert knowledge of how to use soil saturation to cause a collapse. Had his response to her tunnel been simple improvisation, or was it the practiced maneuver of someone who knew this game, who had perhaps played it before? Was their entire conflict in Primrose Meadows just a skirmish, a practice run for a much larger war? Karen Dalloway stood in her empty house. The blueprint for Crimson Hawk Ridge spread out on the floor. Her world, which had collapsed and been rebuilt as a small, quiet prison, suddenly expanded into a vast and dangerous new territory. The humiliation, the fear, the defeated, all receded, replaced by a single, electrifying question. Her phone buzzed. It was the realtor. The sale had gone through. The house was no longer hers. She packed the metal box of blueprints into the trunk of her car. She didn't look back at the house or at number 24 as she drove away. She didn't know where she was going, but for the first time in weeks, she had a direction. Her battle with Alex Mercer wasn't over. It had just been a prequel. Richard hadn't just left her a legacy of rules. He had left her a war chest. As she merged onto the highway, she glanced at the passenger seat where she had placed the Crimson Hawk blueprint. A slow smile, the first genuine smile in months, spread across her face. It was a smile that held no humor, only the cold, thrilling promise of meticulously planned revenge. The earth was full of secrets, and she was beginning to realize she was very, very good at digging.